At the final board meeting, my children were celebrating. They had just voted to sell the company I built. They were cashing out. They even wheeled me into the corner, their senile mother, to observe the end. They had no idea the lawyer was about to introduce me as the new 51% owner, and they had no idea I was about to fire them all. The smell of lilies was an invasion. They were everywhere in the house, thick and sweet, a constant reminder of the funeral. It had been 3 days since we buried Robert. My son Thomas swirled the ice in his glass. The sound, a sharp clink-clink, was the only noise in the study. Sarah, my daughter, sat on the edge of the leather sofa. She kept smoothing the front of her black dress. "Mother," Thomas started. He set his glass down on a stack of Robert's old engineering journals. I flinched. "We need to talk about the company." "Of course," I said. My voice was a rasp. I let it be. They expected weakness. It's a lot, Sarah said, her voice soft and practiced. "It's too much for you to handle right now. You need to grieve." She was right. I was grieving. But I was not broken. Thomas pushed a set of documents across the polished desk. "These are just formalities, Mother. Standard operating procedure. It gives us operational control. Lets us and the board handle the day-to-day. You don't have to worry about a thing." I looked at the signature page. Acting CEO, Chairman of the Board, my titles. "Father always said," Thomas began. "I know what your father said," I interrupted. He stopped, surprised. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I forced a small tremor into it. "You're good children. Take care of it. Take care of your father's legacy. My legacy. I was the one who designed the first prototypes. Robert was the salesman. But they had already forgotten that. They both relaxed. Sarah even gave me a small, pitying smile. They kissed my cheek. The smell of Thomas's expensive cologne lingered long after they left the room. I sat there in the quiet until the sun went down. 6 months passed. The lilies were gone. The house was just quiet. Thomas stopped by every Friday. He called it checking in. I called it reporting. "Mother, you look well," he said, walking into the study. He never sat. He paced. He was always pacing. "I'm fine, Thomas. How is the company?" He sighed, a loud, dramatic sound. He loosened his tie. It's a difficult market." He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and showed me a graph. A sharp red line pointed down. "We're hemorrhaging, Mother. The old way of doing things. It's just not working. The market has shifted." I looked at the numbers. They were terrible. They were also not the real numbers. "What do you propose?" I asked. "We have to trim the fat," he said. He tapped the screen. "The logistics wing. It's redundant. We can outsource. A competitor, Taggart Holdings, has made a very generous offer to take it off our hands. It will give us the liquid capital we need to right the ship." I kept my face perfectly still. The logistics wing was my design. It was the most efficient, profitable part of the entire company. It was the fat that fed everything else. "If you think that's best, Thomas," I said. "You're in charge now." He beamed. He actually beamed. "I knew you'd understand. It's for the best. Protect the legacy." He left and I waited a full hour. Then I walked to my desk. I didn't use the tablet Thomas had given me, the one preloaded with apps for seniors. I opened the false panel in the back of the heavy wooden bookshelf. Behind it was my old terminal, the one that fed directly into the company's mainframe, the one I built with a backdoor no one but me knew about. I logged in. I pulled the real ledgers. The logistics wing wasn't just profitable. It was carrying the entire company. Thomas wasn't trimming fat. He was selling the engine for scrap. He was lying. He was stealing. He and Sarah were cashing out. My grief hardened. It turned into something cold and sharp. They thought I was a senile old woman. They thought I was a relic. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I picked up the secure phone in my desk drawer. A simple, untraceable line. I dialed a number from memory. "Mr. Vance," I said. "It's Evelyn Hartwell." "Yes, it has been a very long time." "I'm afraid I have." I paused. "I need you to open a new holding firm for me. Call it ER Investments. For Evelyn and Robert, yes, exactly. I need absolute discretion. No one can ever trace it back to me. What is its purpose? Vance asked, his voice unchanged by the years. Its purpose, I said, looking at the glowing green numbers of my real company, is to buy back every share of Hartwell Industries you can find. Starting today. The first report from Mr. Vance arrived by private courier. It was a simple manila envelope with no return address. I was in the garden pretending to trim the roses when it arrived. I took it, tucked it into my gardening apron, and waited until my housekeeper, Maria, had gone to the market. I opened it in the study. My hands did not shake. The document was 1 page. It detailed ER Investments' first purchase, a 2% block of public shares. The price was low. Thomas's sale of the logistics wing had worried the market, just as he'd intended. I read the numbers, then I walked to the fireplace. I struck a match and held the page until it was black ash. I crushed the ash with a fireplace poker. This became my routine. The years began to blur, marked only by these transactions. Thomas and Sarah took larger and larger salaries. They bought new houses. They went on long vacations. Every time, they would visit me first, their faces full of concern. "The company needs a new investment in R&D, Mother," Sarah told me one afternoon. It was 2 years after Robert's death. She was wearing a new diamond bracelet. "We're going to have to sell the downtown property. It's just old. It's a drain." "That was your father's first office," I said, letting my voice sound thin. "I know," she said, placing her hand on mine. Her skin was smooth, and we'll keep the plaque, of course. But the building is failing. It's for the best, I nodded slowly. "Whatever you think is right, dear." "You know I don't understand these things." She kissed my forehead. "You're a comfort, Mother." That night, I was on the secure line. "Vance, they're selling the downtown property." "Yes, I know. The stock will drop. Be ready to buy every share that panics. Use the reserve fund," I hung up. I didn't feel comfort. I felt focused. I lived 2 lives. In one, I was Evelyn Hartwell, the quiet widow. I attended charity lunches. I sat in my garden. I complained that the new tablets Thomas bought me were confusing. He and Sarah found this charming. They hired a nurse, then a companion, a kind young woman named Elena, to make sure I wasn't lonely. I liked Elena. She read to me. And she was a very sound sleeper. After Elena went to bed, my second life would start. I would go to the study, lock the door, and open the hidden panel. My old terminal hummed. The green text on the black screen was my true companion. Year 4. Thomas restructured the sales division. He fired half the staff, all of them loyal to me and Robert. He called it optimizing. The stock dipped. I told Vance to buy. ER Investments reached 23%, year 7. Sarah wanted to launch a lifestyle brand. It was a failure. It cost the company millions. She covered the loss by selling off 2 of our most valuable patents. She told me they were outdated. The stock staggered. I told Vance to buy. ER Investments reached 38%, year 9. They moved me out of the main house. "It's too much for you, Mother," Thomas said. They moved me into the guest wing. It's all on 1 floor. Much safer. My study, Robert's study, was packed up. They boxed my books. They tried to remove the heavy wooden bookshelf. "No," I said. It was the first time I had raised my voice in almost a decade. They both stopped, shocked. "That was your father's. It stays." Thomas rolled his eyes, but he agreed. "Fine. Leave the dusty old thing." That night I waited until 2 in the morning. I slipped out of my new room, my feet silent in their soft slippers. The house was cold. I went to the old study. The room was empty except for the bookshelf. I opened the panel. The terminal was still there. I had paid the movers extra in cash to make sure it was. I logged in. I contacted Vance. "It's time to accelerate," I told him. "I want 49%. I don't care what it costs. The last year was a blur of purchases. Small blocks, large blocks. Vance was a genius. He used shell companies. He bought from overseas markets. My children never saw him coming. They were too busy arguing with each other. Their greed had made them sloppy. Then, last week, the message came. Not on the terminal. A simple, hand-delivered note from Vance. It said, "They are selling the whole company. Taggart Holdings. The final board meeting is in 2 days. We have 49%. I burned the note. 49% was not enough. I needed a majority. I needed 51%, I called him. "Where is the other 2%, Vance?" "It's held by the board," he said. "The 2 vice presidents, Thomas and Sarah's men. They won't sell." "Not them," I said. "There must be someone else." "There is," he said, his voice hesitant. "A final block. 2%? It's held in your own name, Mrs. Hartwell. Your grieving widow shares. The ones they left you," I stopped. I had completely forgotten. The 10% they had left me. The shares they'd reduced to a meaningless 2% through dilution and restructuring. "They think those shares are non-voting," Vance said. "They are," I said, "unless the original owner's contract is invoked." "The keyman clause?" Vance said, his voice full of surprise. "Mrs. Hartwell, that clause is ancient." "It is," I said. "And I'm the keyman. Transfer my 2% to ER Investments. Now." There was a long pause. "That is highly aggressive. It will be seen. It will alert them." "No, it won't," I said. "They aren't looking. They're celebrating." I looked at the invitation sitting on my desk. A final board meeting to ratify the sale. They had invited me as an observer. "Do it, Vance," I said. "They've called the meeting. It's time to attend." Elena, my companion, pushed my wheelchair into the elevator. "Are you sure you feel up to this, Mrs. Hartwell?" she whispered. Her face was kind. "You look very tired." "I am fine, Elena," I said, patting her hand. "Just an old woman seeing an old chapter close." I had insisted on the wheelchair. It was a wonderful prop. It made me smaller. It made them more comfortable. The elevator doors opened onto the 30th floor. The doors to the main boardroom were already open. I could hear their voices, bright and sharp. The air was chilled, and it smelled of glass cleaner and coffee. Thomas saw me first. His smile faltered for just a second. He was not expecting me to actually come. "Mother," he said, walking over. He was wearing a dark blue suit that probably cost as much as my first car. "You made it. We thought you'd be more comfortable at home." "I wanted to be here," I said. My voice was a weak, paper-thin sound. "To see the end." Of course," Sarah said, rushing over. She kissed the air near my cheek. Her perfume was strong, a heavy floral scent. "We're so glad you're here. We've put a chair for you right in the corner. You can listen in, but you don't have to worry about a thing." She and Thomas wheeled me not to the great mahogany table, but to a small, upholstered chair set against the wall. An observer's chair. A naughty chair for a child who could not be trusted at the adults' table. It was perfect. I had a clear view of everyone. Thomas, Sarah, their 2 vice presidents, young men with identical haircuts and empty eyes, and at the head of the table, Mr. Davies, the corporate lawyer. He was a gray man, his face a map of neutral lines. He looked at me, and his expression did not change. He simply nodded once. "Well," Thomas said, clapping his hands together. He stood at the front of the room, by a large screen. "Let's get this started." He clicked a button. A graph appeared. It was the same one he had shown me all those years ago, the sharp red line pointing down. "As you can see," Thomas said, his voice slick, "the company is Frankly, it's failing." He paced as he talked. He used words like hemorrhaging and market shift and untenable. He was a good performer. He was smooth. He was confident. He was a magnificent liar. I looked at his shoes. They were polished to a mirror shine. I thought about the men and women he'd fired from the sales division. I thought about the patents Sarah had sold. "Selling to Taggart Holdings is not a defeat," Thomas said, trying to look sad. "It's a mercy. It's the only way to protect what's left of Father's legacy." I almost laughed. My legacy. The one I built with my own hands. The one I was about to take back. Sarah chimed in. "Mother, we know this is hard for you." Her voice was high and bright. She turned to me, her face a mask of loving concern. "But it truly is for the best. Taggart will take good care of everyone." I just nodded. I let my eyes look distant, confused. Thomas smiled. "Thank you, Sarah. Now, Mr. Davies, I believe it's time to make it official." Mr. Davies adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the papers in front of him. "We will now call the motion to vote on the full acquisition by Taggart Holdings. All in favor?" Thomas's hand shot up. "Aye." Sarah's followed. "Aye." The two vice presidents, the yes-men, echoed the vote. "Aye." "Aye." Mr. Davies made a small check mark for each. Then his eyes found me in the corner. "And Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell. As an observer and minority shareholder. A formality. My 2%. Meaningless." I said nothing. I just smiled. A small, vague, senile smile. Thomas let out a small, impatient sigh. She abstains, I suppose. It doesn't matter. The vote passes." "The A's have it," Mr. Davies confirmed, his voice flat. Thomas clapped his hands together. A single loud crack in the quiet room. "Well, that's that. A new chapter. Drinks at the Palm tonight, everyone. On me." Sarah was already on her phone, her thumb moving fast. She was texting, no doubt, telling the Taggart people the deal was done. They were celebrating. They were cashing out. They were all standing, gathering their briefcases, shaking hands. "Not quite," Mr. Davies said. The room stopped. The chatter, the movement, it all just stopped. Thomas's smile froze. "I'm sorry, Davies. The vote passed. It's done." "The vote to sell has passed," Davies clarified. He did not look up from his papers. However, the Taggart offer was contingent on a final 30-day review. During that window, another party, a majority shareholder, activated their claim. Thomas laughed. It was a short, sharp sound like a bark. "A majority shareholder? What are you talking about, Davies? We are the majority shareholders." "That appears to be the error in your assumption," Davies said. He was still looking at his papers. He was a rock. "A private holding firm has been quietly acquiring company stock for the past 10 years. "What firm?" Sarah demanded. Her voice was too high. She had stood up. "It's called it.I Investments," Davies said. I watched their faces. The name meant nothing to them. Evelyn and Robert. I had chosen it for myself. A private little joke. "it.I Investments?" Thomas said, scoffing. "Never heard of them. This is a joke. Some corporate raid? They can't do this. We have the votes." "No, Mr. Hartwell," Davies said. He finally lifted his head. His eyes were clear and direct. "You do not." As of 11:59 p.m. last night, it.I Investments finalized a transfer that brought their total ownership to 51%. The room went absolutely silent. The hum of the air conditioning was suddenly loud. 51? Sarah whispered. She looked pale. That's impossible. How? Thomas demanded. His voice was a low growl. Where did they get the shares? We control the board. They've been buying the public float for a decade, Mr. Hartwell, Davies said. Every time you restructured, every time you sold an asset, the stock value shifted. They bought. They were very patient, but 51%. It's not possible, Thomas insisted. He was running the numbers in his head. I could see it. We still held the VPs and us. We held the majority. You held a plurality, Davies corrected. The final 2% was acquired last night. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. The sound made the VPs jump. From who? Who sold? Was it you? He snarled, pointing at one of the young men. The final 2%, Davies said. His voice, cutting through the anger, was transferred from the personal holdings of Mrs. Evelyn Hartwell. Every head in the room turned. They all stared at me, sitting in my little corner chair. Thomas's face was a mixture of fury and confusion. He walked over to me, looming over the wheelchair. "Mother?" he said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "What did you do?" I looked up at him. I let my eyes look wide and frightened. "Thomas, I don't—" "Did someone call you, Mother?" Sarah rushed over, grabbing my arm. Her nails dug in. "That lawyer, Vance? Did he call you? Did he trick you into signing something?" She's senile." Thomas yelled, not at me, but at Davies. "She's not competent. You can't accept a sale from her. We're her proxies. This is illegal." "On the contrary," Davies said, holding up a single piece of paper. "The transfer was not a sale. It was an invocation, Mrs. Hartwell's original keyman clause. Ancient, but as I've spent all morning confirming, perfectly ironclad. She transferred her shares to the holding company she controls. It's all legal." Thomas and Sarah just stared. They looked from Davies to the paper and back to me. The word controls was hanging in the air. "She controls?" Sarah repeated. Her voice was a wisp. Thomas was shaking his head. No. She doesn't know how to use a computer. She can't even work her phone. Someone is using her. Vance. It's Vance. I'll sue him. I'll destroy him." "Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell," Davies said, standing up. "The vote to sell is void. The new owner, it.I Investments, has declined the Taggart offer. This meeting is to ratify the sale. As there is no sale, this meeting is complicated." "I want them here," Thomas yelled. "I want to see the face of the man who did this. Get it.I Investments in here now." "That," Mr. Davies said, "can be arranged." He paused, looking at the door, then back at the fuming, panicked faces of my children. "The new owner wished to be present for the transition," Davies said. "They are, in fact, waiting just outside. They asked to be introduced as soon as the Taggart sale was officially canceled." He nodded to the heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom. "We will now introduce the new owner." Every eye in the room, including my own, fixed on those doors. The air was so tight I could barely breathe. I watched Thomas and Sarah. They looked like they were facing a firing squad. They were braced, ready to fight, ready to yell at whatever corporate shark was about to walk through that door. The handle turned, the door opened, and Elena, my companion, pushed an empty wheelchair into the room. Thomas and Sarah stared at the open doorway. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. They were braced like animals expecting a blow. "Well?" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking. "Where are they?" The door opened wider. A man stepped in. He was older, with a trim white beard and a perfectly tailored gray suit. He carried a thin leather briefcase. It was Mr. Vance, my lawyer, my broker, the architect of it.I Investments. Thomas's face went purple with rage. "Vance, you—" "It was you. You old vulture. You preyed on my senile mother." "That's slander, Mr. Hartwell," Vance said. His voice was calm, a cool counterpoint to Thomas's heat. "And it's incorrect." Sarah was shaking. "We'll have your license. We'll have you arrested." "You tricked her." "I have done nothing," Vance said, "except follow the precise, legal, and brilliant instructions of my client." He walked past them, stopping at the head of the table. He set his briefcase down and snapped it open. He looked at Mr. Davies, and they exchanged a small, barely perceptible nod. "Your client?" Thomas said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Who? Some corporate raider in another country? A coward who hides behind you?" "My client has been in this room the entire time," Vance said. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. Every other person did. Thomas, Sarah, the two vice presidents. Their heads turned slowly all at once. They stared at me, the old woman, the relic, sitting in the corner in her wheelchair. Thomas let out a short, broken laugh. "What, her? You're joking. This is insane. She thinks I'm my father half the time." I looked at my son. I saw the greed, the arrogance, the casual cruelty he mistook for strength. "No, Thomas," I said. My voice was not the thin, frail rasp I had used for 10 years. It was the voice that had built this company. Clear, cold, and final. The sound of it made him flinch. "I have never, not for 1 second, mistaken you for your father." I placed my hands on the arms of the wheelchair. I pushed the light wool blanket off my lap. It pooled on the floor, and I stood up. My legs were stiff, but they were strong. I had not stopped my physical therapy. Not for a single day. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. A small, strangled sound came out. "But your arthritis," she stammered. "Your hip." "Was a lie," I said. One of many. I took a step. The sound of my sensible heel on the hardwood floor was like a gunshot in the silent room. I walked away from the observer's chair. I walked towards the head of the table. "You," Thomas whispered. He was pale. "It was you. ER Investments, Evelyn and Robert." It was you." "Yes," I said. I reached the head of the table. I stood opposite Mr. Vance. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Vance." "A pleasure, Mrs. Hartwell," he said. You can't!" Sarah shrieked. It was not a word. It was a noise. "This is our company. Father left it to us." "Your father," I said, turning to face her, "left his shares to me. You and Thomas convinced me to give you operational control. You told me I was grieving. You told me I was confused. You told me the company was failing." I looked from her to Thomas. "You lied." I picked up the Taggart Holdings sales agreement from the table. I looked at the signature page. "The sale," I said, "is canceled." I tore the thick document in half. The sound of ripping paper was the only thing in the room. "And as the new sole and active owner of Hartwell Industries," I said, "this board is dissolved. Your services," I said to the two pale vice presidents, "are no longer required. Security will see you out." They scrambled, grabbing their phones and tablets, and practically ran from the room. They did not look back. Now it was just family. Thomas was shaking. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. You're not going to get away with this. I'll fight you. I'll take you to court. I'll prove you're incompetent. You will what, Thomas?" I asked. I did not raise my voice. "You'll tell a judge you've spent 10 years stealing from a company you thought was run by a senile old woman? You'll show them the ledgers? The real ones, or the fake ones you showed me?" His mouth opened, then closed. "You're all fired." "You're all fired," the words hung in the air. The air conditioning clicked on, a low hum filling the silence. Sarah was the first to break. It was not a scream. It was a high, thin sound like a kettle boiling. "Fired? You can't fire us. This is our company. Thomas, do something." Thomas was not moving. He was staring at me, his face a terrible mottled white. The only color was in his eyes, a deep, burning red. He looked like his father, not the kind, smiling man, but the man I once saw in a boardroom in Chicago, the one who had just been betrayed. "You," he whispered. "You sat there. In your chair, in your wheelchair, you watched us. For 10 years, I let you do nothing," I said. "I remained standing at the head of the table. I watched you do exactly what you chose to do. You sold my assets. You fired my people. You tried to sell my company. Those were your choices. These are the consequences. I will see you in court, he hissed. I will have you declared incompetent. I'll take everything. Your lawyer, I said, will be speaking with Mr. Vance and Mr. Davies. I believe they will find the documentation comprehensive. Mr. Vance stepped forward, holding a single thin file. This is a cease and desist letter, Mr. Hartwell, and a copy of your mother's full, court-certified competency exam taken 72 hours ago. You will find she scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function. Thomas's mouth opened and closed. And, I added, I believe security is here. I had not called them. Mr. Vance had arranged it. He was a very thorough man. The heavy oak doors opened again. 2 uniformed security guards stepped inside. They were not men I recognized. They were new, part of Thomas's optimized staff. They looked nervous, their eyes shifting from Thomas to Sarah to me. Mrs. Hartwell? The lead guard asked. He was looking at me, but his head was tilted toward Thomas, the man who signed his paychecks. I am Evelyn Hartwell, I said. I am the sole owner of this company. Mr. Thomas Hartwell and Ms. Sarah Hartwell are trespassing. Please escort them from the building. The guard's confusion cleared. He had his orders. Sir, ma'am, the guard said, taking a step toward Thomas. If you'll come with us. Don't you touch me. Thomas roared. He swiped his briefcase off the table. Papers scattered. Do you know who I am? You're the man who just got fired, I said. Get out. Sarah was a wreck. Her face was streaked with black makeup. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging in again, this time not in pity, but in desperation. Mother, please, she sobbed. Don't do this. We're your family. What are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to go? I looked at her hand on my arm. Then I looked at her face. You should have thought of that, I said, before you tried to sell my home. I pulled my arm away. The guards were firm. One took Thomas by the elbow. The other gently, but insistently, guided Sarah toward the door. Thomas went stiff. For a moment I thought he would fight. I thought he would throw a punch. But he just deflated. The anger went out of him, leaving something small and ugly. He stopped at the door. He turned and looked at me, a long, hollow look. Father, he would be so ashamed of you, Thomas spat. He would be ashamed of you, I said, my voice quiet. Now goodbye, Thomas. They were gone. The door clicked shut. The room was a mess. Papers were on the floor. Sarah's empty coffee cup was overturned. The smell of her strong, floral perfume was already starting to fade. I stood there for a long time. Mr. Davies was quietly gathering the documents. Mr. Vance was closing his briefcase. I walked over to the windows. The glass was cold. I looked down, 30 floors at the city. My city. I turned back to the room. I looked at the long mahogany table. I walked to the chairman's seat. The one Thomas had been standing in front of. The one my husband had used. The one I had bought. I sat down. The leather was cool. It felt right. Mr. Vance looked at me. Mrs. Hartwell, what is your first order? I picked up the phone from the console in the center of the table. The plastic was warm. I pressed the number for the internal directory. I did not need to look it up, a woman's voice answered. Thomas Hartwell's office. No, I said. This is Evelyn Hartwell's office. Get me David Al-Jamil in engineering. Now there was a pause. A click. Then another voice, hesitant. This is David? David, I said. This is Evelyn Hartwell. Yes, I'm back. I want you to call the entire old R&D team. The ones Thomas fired. Call all of them. Tell them to be here tomorrow at 8 a.m. Tell them we have a lot of work to do. The next morning, I did not use the side entrance. I did not take the service elevator. I walked through the main lobby at 7:55 a.m. I wore a dark blue suit, the one I had hidden under my beige knit jacket. My shoes were low, sensible heels, and they made a sharp, clean click, click, click on the polished marble floor. The morning sun was cutting through the high glass windows. The air smelled of strong, fresh-brewed coffee from the cart in the corner. A few employees, the new ones, the ones Thomas hired, were gathered by the elevators. They looked at me, this old woman they had never seen, and then they looked away. To them I was just a visitor, a grandmother, a nobody. I stepped into an empty elevator. I pressed the button for the 30th floor. The doors closed, and I watched my reflection. My hair was gray, pulled back in a simple tight bun. My eyes were clear. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. It was silent. Mr. Vance had been thorough. My children's offices and those of their vice presidents were dark. I walked down the long hall. At the end was the corner office, the big one, the one I had designed for Robert, the one Thomas had taken. I pushed the heavy glass door open. The room was cold. Thomas had redecorated. Everything was black leather, dark chrome, and smoked glass. His desk was a massive piece of black stone. His personal effects were gone. Mr. Vance's team had been efficient. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was the same. The city, my city, spread out below. I could see the river, a gray ribbon in the morning light. I placed my hand on the cold glass. I was standing there when the door opened. Mrs. Hartwell? I turned. It was David Al-Jamil, my old head of engineering. His hair, which had been dark brown, was now mostly gray. He held an old, worn leather briefcase in his hand. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "David," I said. I smiled. It was a real smile. "You came. I got your message," he said. His voice was rough. I didn't believe it. I thought it was a joke, a cruel one. Then I saw the news alerts this morning about the Taggart sale. "It's good to see you," I said. "The others?" "I called who I could," he said, stepping into the room. "They're on their way. They're scared, Evelyn. They're excited. They don't know what to think." "Good," I said. "We have work to do." He nodded, a small, jerky motion. What do we do?" "We start," I said, "by fixing what's broken." Over the next hour, they arrived. One by one, then in small groups. The old guard, the people I had hired, the ones Thomas had called fat and redundant and outdated, Maria from logistics, who had cried when Thomas fired her. Ben from sales, the best salesman I ever knew. The entire R&D team David had managed. They filled the cold, sterile office, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and a small, dangerous spark of hope. They gathered around the massive, ugly stone desk. I did not sit. "Thomas told me this company was failing," I said. My voice was clear in the quiet room. He was wrong. But he was trying very hard to make it true. I motioned for David. He opened his briefcase and pulled out not a tablet, but a roll of old blueprints. He spread them across the desk. "He sold the logistics wing," I said, pointing to the designs. "He called it a drain. He was a fool. It was not a drain. It was the engine. It was our advantage. It was what I designed, Evelyn," David said gently. "It's gone. Taggart bulldozed the entire property last year." "I know," I said. "So we will build it again." I unrolled a second set of blueprints. These were new, crisp, white paper, with notes in my own handwriting in the margins. "He thought I was a senile old woman," I said. "He thought I sat in a chair and knitted." I did not. I worked. I showed them the new designs, the ones I had been running on my terminal in the study for 10 years. It was the old logistics wing, but faster, more efficient, optimized in a way Thomas, with his buzzwords, could never understand. The energy in the room changed. The shock and fear faded. The silence was replaced by a low, excited murmur. David leaned in, his eyes scanning the plans. This fluid dynamic, where did you... "The bypass loop," Maria said, her finger tracing a line. "You fixed the bottleneck." "If we use the new composites," Ben said, We could cut the weight. We could double the output. Soon they were not talking to me. They were talking to each other. They were grabbing pens from Thomas's empty desk cups. They were arguing. They were designing. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of my company coming back to life. It was the hum of the engine starting up again. I left them to it. I walked to the smaller, empty office that had been Sarah's. I sat at her desk. It was white and gold. I picked up the phone. "Mr. Vance?" I said. "Yes, it's done?" "No, they're fine. One more thing." I looked around the white office. "I want this floor redecorated. All of it. I want the old furniture back. And I want my desk. The one from the guest wing." Vance paused. The bookshelf, Mrs. Hartwell?" "No," I said. "The desk in front of the bookshelf. The heavy wooden one. Have it brought to the corner office immediately." I hung up the phone. Through the wall, I could hear David and Maria arguing loudly about load-bearing. I smiled. I picked up a pen and a blank legal pad. My hand was perfectly steady. I got to work.